I will say like the biggest act of surrender for me was around losing a family member. I lost my sister to mental health during this experience, and I like literally don't have a relationship with her anymore.
Hello and welcome to the Business of Happiness. I'm your host, Dr. Tarryn MacCarthy. Today, my friends, is going to be such a phenomenal day because we have with us the one and only MaryBeth Hyland. Welcome, MaryBeth.
Oh my gosh, it's such a gift to be here with you.
Oh, I'm so excited. MaryBeth, for my audience who may not be familiar with your incredible body of work, you are the founder and chief visionary of SparkVision, which is a values-based mindfulness coaching for leaders and their teams. And you are the author of Permission to be Human, which I love that title, the subtitle, The Conscious Leader's Guide to Creating a Values-Driven Culture. You are speaking to my soul, MaryBeth. I am so excited to have you on the show.
Uh,
Welcome.
I knew like instantly that I was in the right place.
So
We
share with
clearly
us.
share a lot of similar values here.
So cool, so cool. And thank you for all that you do, because bringing this to leaders is so impactful.
Pardon me.
Ooh, no problem. Mic drop.
Literally, my cell phone just dropped to the floor. That's a sign. Like, make sure it's away.
Yeah. Be present in this moment.
Yeah.
Um, just so grateful to you for doing this work and for bringing this to leaders, because as you do, I believe so deeply in empowering leaders so that they can empower others and really change our culture for the better. I'd love for you to share with us a little bit of your background and your story of how you came to this work.
Yeah, well, I'm so grateful for this opportunity to have this conversation with you today, and clearly this great energetic connection, and I trust your community is of that vibe too. And so, yeah, this work has been something that's been brewing inside of me for a really long time, and this is actually how I start my book out. Is that I really felt like for most of my career when I was working inside of companies, like I was an employee, that I was just such an underdog, that I was just so alone. And I was constantly feeling like something was wrong with me because I cared so much about people and their experience at work. Like I deeply cared about my colleagues and when things were happening that were like not right, or when something great happened and that person wasn't being celebrated. And then also when I was working with volunteers and just like, wait a minute, this is not how you engage volunteers, right? These are people. These are folks that have their own dreams and aspirations, and we can come together through those things. So really my work started out from working from organization to organization. My background's in social work and I have my master's in nonprofit management. So I primarily worked in the nonprofit sector, and job after job, I really thought like, this is going to be the one, this is going to be the one where I work for the rest of my life. And, that was my role model. And my mother was like, she worked at the same place for 30 years. So I was just looking for that. I just thought that was like a normal thing. And it obviously is not, especially not today. It's very abnormal. And eventually got to a point where I had this opportunity to take over a program when I was working at the United Way. And it was a program that I just saw at a distance. I was like, I know that I could do something with this. Like, please let me get my hands on it. And when the person who had started it stepped away, they said, all right, MaryBeth, you can take over this young professional engagement program. And so very quickly, because of caring so deeply about people and wanting to create these cultures where people can thrive and feel really deeply connected to themselves and a higher purpose, the program that I took over became the best practice model globally for United Way and young professional engagement. And membership quadrupled in a year. And so it was one of these like, whoa, they'd never seen anything like this before. And for me, I was just doing like the human thing. I was just doing things that how I would want to be treated, right? And creating experiences that were based on shared value and empowering people to live those values and take ownership over it and things like that. And so when it was time for me to go, when I knew it was time to step out on my own and start my own business, I really didn't know like what was going to be the thing that I was going to do with my business. But I did know that the like magic, the secret sauce that everybody was asking me to help them out with, and all these other United Ways all over the world, was how do you engage people, right? And how do you create a sense of belonging and connection in a way that's authentic and not contrived, not like the voluntold kind of models of the past. And so I was like, there's something to that, and I need to explore that further. So when I stepped out on my own and started my company SparkVision 7 years ago, I started to get really clear on what were the components that made that sense of belonging, created that connection, made a culture where people wanted to be. And that's how I eventually started to get to the core of it was these shared values. It was actually having clearly defined and lived and values that were being used to hold people accountable to those behaviors and norms. And so that's where I started to do this work that I have this incredible honor of doing now with individuals and organizations, of really helping them to uncover what makes them authentically who they are as an individual or as an organization at large, right? A whole bunch of individuals coming together. But then more importantly, how do you actually live that way? Like, it's one thing to have the words and to have them defined. It's a very different thing to say, how am I going to actually embody this and not violate this? And how I'm going to hold myself and others lovingly accountable when we inevitably don't, right? When we inevitably have a bad day or we're off. And in the process of doing that, how do we give ourselves permission to be human? Because that's really the point of this work that I do. Is it's not like a set it and forget it. Oh, now you've got your values, you're set, right? No, it's a daily practice, just like being a human is a daily practice, right? Of grace and compassion and all those things when we're at our best. And so that's the core of what I do now. And it all came from feeling like I was the only one who cared about those things.
Oh, it's so beautiful and so powerful because there's so many intricacies in there in terms of leadership and trust and authenticity, and even just having a direction and a sense of what success and happiness means to you. Once you go through that work, it's so powerful. I have a question that comes from a debate that I've heard between many people who work in this values driven space. And I'd love your opinion on this. Do you think that our values are consistent over our lifetime? We're just kind of trying to narrow in and figure out with clarity what they are, or do you think that they change as we evolve and grow?
I absolutely know that some stay consistent and others change.
Wonderful.
In that, right? So a lot of times we are like, okay, forever, authenticity is who I am and what I care about and all these things. But if you really take the time to, and this is the gift of the work I get to do, is I lead people through this process, right? To really take the time to honor your journey in your values, right? So people will like see a list of words, they'll pick off the words, and then they're like, okay, here are my values. But very few people actually take the time to honor, where did those come from, right? How are those instilled in me for better or worse, right? Because of things we wanted to emulate or the things we never wanted to emulate, right? And how can we notice what was going on in our lives? What were those milestone moments where our values then changed, right? Because this happens a lot when maybe there's a death or a birth that happens very frequently. All of a sudden, I mean, my husband and I went from being newlyweds to unexpectedly becoming foster parents. All of a sudden, very different set of values, very different set of values that weren't there because that wasn't a part of our picture, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, we still had the consistency of things like spirituality that really mattered to us through that experience. But I think it's a really beautiful thing when people invest the time and energy to check in I check in on my values once a quarter. I know that's probably a lot for most people, but this is, the work that I do. My husband and I actually do it together, and we compare and we see what's changed. And it's this like beautiful unfolding of like, oh my gosh, that was an aspirational value and now it's a lived one, right?
Mm.
Things like that. But that's, I think, at least once a year, particularly when you're doing these like, end of year reflections, or maybe around your birthday, whatever feels like an important milestone, like check in and see what is consistent and what has shifted. And then you can really honor your journey and why that's showing up that way.
I love that practice you just hinted towards, which is the act of celebrating the values that were aspirational once and now are lived values. So once you decide to really incorporate them in your lifestyle and live the values that you intend to, having some reflection to celebrate them as well.
Yes, it's so key, right? I think we, as humans, this is kind of like we give ourselves permission to be perfect. Very rarely do we give the permission to be human. And when we're like so focused on being perfect, we forget to celebrate. We forget
Mm-hmm.
to celebrate what we're doing amazingly well, even if it's a tiny, teeny little thing. I'm just like, wow, I didn't think that I could do that. And now I am doing that. And that's worth honoring and celebrating. And that's a big part of my work as well, is helping to remind people of how important it is to have time to pause,
Mm-hmm.
to make that connection, and then to honor it in whatever way that seems right to you, whatever form of celebration that makes sense.
Yeah, it's such an important part of happiness, and also self image and self worth, being able to see that there's progress happening, that you can make progress, and then celebrating those things, those goals, and those intentions when you arrive.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's so true. So well said.
One of the other things that I'm so excited to talk to you about today, I noticed on your website, and we're going to leave all the links for Spark Vision and to your incredible book in the show notes. But on your website, you have this fabulous blog, and I loved reading all of your recent blog entries. But one of them that really caught my eye was a blog about surrender, and I'd love, if with your permission, please, Mary Beth, if you would read it to us. It's just beautifully written. I love the poetry of it. And then I'd love us to just talk about it a little bit, because this idea of surrender has been a big buzzword, but also such a powerful superpower for leaders, leaders of their teams and leaders of their own dreams. So would you mind sharing that with
Oh
us
my gosh.
today?
Well, first of all, it is just such an honor to be asked. To give a little bit of context, every year I pick a word of the year. And so
Ah.
surrender was my word for 2021. And the way that I honor and celebrate that word, it's a value also, surrender is a value, is that I write a poem at the end of the year. So that's sort of my way of encapsulating what was that year like? What was that journey like?
Mm.
So yeah, so this is what I do pretty much every January as a part of my process, and
Ooh, I
I'm
love that. Oh, I love
yes.
that. I love completing and packaging the year that way. All right, so please share it with us.
Yeah. All right. So this is called my year of surrender. After years of controlling, questioning, and doubt, she finally chose to release the stories that weren't serving, the relationships that were self-harming, and the experiences that were triggering. She sang to her wounds, allowed them to share their pain, and learned each of their names. In a
Mm,
slow dance of completion, she pulled the wisdom from each one and stitched up the rest. With that medicine brewing inside her, she grew stronger, wiser, and more patient. She leaned towards love. Like a flower in the darkness, stretching towards the light, she finally felt the nourishment that was always there for her to taste. Love for herself,
mm,
love for her truth, love for what is and what isn't. The healing transmuted to trust, the trust ignited intuition, and the intuition created knowing. From that well of infinite possibilities, she finally chose to surrender.
that's beautiful. It's so beautiful. I mean, I have tears coming to my eyes. It's beautiful.
I didn't realize I was going to get so choked up revisiting that poem. I mean, it really surrender, as you said, when you kick this off, it's just such a powerful tool, right?
Mm,
It's such a powerful value to live. It's such a powerful way of being. And it's so hard. It's
mm,
like the hardest of all the things because we just want to strive and control and fight for it and hustle and muscle. And that's
mm,
really how I've been programmed. And so the year of surrender was exactly on time.
mm,
And so the end of the poem where it says, the healing transmuted to trust, the trust ignited intuition, and intuition created knowing. My years before surrender were intuition and trust and
mm,
healing.
mm.
So that's really was like the journey for me that I needed to do those things to surrender. Like I couldn't surrender before those pieces
Mm.
were in place.
Mm. I think that's why I love that word surrender because it encapsulates so many of those values and superpowers in terms of having confidence and calm and ease and trust all at once. It takes all of those and puts them in one place. Um, what what else did you learn during your year of surrender? Because it sounds like there is a ton of insight in there that you just revealed in the poem in terms of the wounds and acknowledging the wounds and the lessons within there, but give us some insight of what this year of surrender taught you.
Oh my gosh. I'm a recovering work addict, and I don't say that like a tongue-in-cheek workaholic thing. I mean that I was clinically diagnosed with it and that I
Mm,
had to go to treatment for it. I did
mm,
not know how to not work in order to feel a sense of enoughness or worthiness or purpose or I grew up in a very toxic, abusive household where I was told that I wasn't good enough. So like this was really deeply ingrained in me of like, prove yourself, prove yourself, prove yourself, prove yourself. It'll never be good enough though. It'll never be good enough
mm,
though. Right. That kind of thing that I know so many of us can relate to, but we don't often take the time to be present with those patterns and how they really train you from the time you're a kid of like the way you ultimately wind up showing up in whatever you do as an adult. And so this year of surrender, as I said, I had to do all this inner healing work to get to that point. But I have been, I would say, in the last 3 years on a very intentional spiritual journey, which prior to that, I did not have any kinds of spiritual beliefs. I mean, I believed there was a higher power. I believed that there was certainly things working in my favor or not in my favor that I didn't have control of, right? But I didn't really have a practice or rituals or connection in that way. And so surrender really came to me when I started to go more deeply into my spiritual journey and
mm,
really got to the place of not just thinking it's a nice idea to believe that things are working out in my favor, right? Or thinking it's a nice idea that, things happen for a reason, but rather like knowing that, right?
mm,
I come from a place now that I know I have full faith, not hope, but faith that whatever is happening or occurring is happening for me and not to me. And so when I can take that approach from a place of somebody who's done a lot of inner work to not be living in a place of victimhood, which I was for a very, very long time and still have bouts of it. But it was like, well, then if that's really the truth, then why do I have to keep striving so much, right?
mhm,
Why do I have to keep hurting myself in this kind of work addictive behaviors and feelings of not enoughness that were just on constant repeat? And so the act of surrender was a lot. I was looking so hard for like the how to surrender book. Like,
ah, yep, that sounds like a workaholic to me.
yeah,
Show me
it
what
was like,
to do.
give me the steps,
Yeah.
tell
How
me
do
the
I do this
process, right?
surrender
I
thing?
will
Yeah.
do it so well once I can
Uh-huh.
follow the
I'll be
steps.
the best at it, by the way.
Yes, exactly, exactly. I'm going to be the number one surrenderer, right?
Yeah, yeah. If you're listening to this podcast, chances are you didn't get into business to be miserable. The problem is that people feel that if their business gets busier, if they start becoming more successful, that happiness will eventually set in, but it can actually get worse. This is why I created the Business of Happiness Prosperity Coaching. In this one-on-one coaching, we look at how to redefine success on your terms and re-find the joy and the passion in your dream. Visit me at thebizofhappiness.com and become the happiest business owner you know.
And so what was powerful about the experience was that that's not how it works, right? That's not how it works, because while there's certainly practices that we can share with each other, and I'd be happy to share some of those today if you're interested. It's so unique to each person, right? Each individual, because of what's happening inside your head and what you're telling yourself about those circumstances. And I will say, like, the biggest act of surrender for me was around losing a family member. I lost my sister to mental health during this experience, and I literally don't have a relationship with her anymore. And it was this extremely traumatizing, re-traumatizing experience. It brought up a lot of my childhood trauma. Again, it was being lived out with my sister. And it was this experience of like, oh my gosh, how can I surrender to this? Like, I can't surrender to this. I have to make this right. I have to fix this. I have to, be a superwoman and figure out what I can do. And the reality was, there was nothing else I could do. I really couldn't. So it was this huge, the biggest act of surrender of anything I've ever surrendered to as an adult, of just really telling myself, like, there's nothing more that you can do other than, pray, send good energy, have all the best intentions, and just be available. You cannot do somebody else's work for them. And that was a big part of my trauma history, like wanting to do the work of the people who were traumatizing me for them, right?
Yeah.
And so it was an experience. This has just been so powerful, and like having to surrender to something that is very hard when it comes to, family members, and not wanting that to be the result.
Yeah. It's so funny. I'm reminded of this quote by Marianne Williamson. It's a famous one. I'm sure you've heard it, but the moment of surrender is not when life is over, but when it just begins, or something like that. There's that beautiful quote. And there's a certain, almost, if we took the word empowerment and replaced it for life, the moment of surrender is not when empowerment is over, but when it just begins. There's a certain amount of empowerment that you have when you release to surrender to what is. It just
Well
takes
said.
all the effort out.
Yes, it does. And I think when I originally thought of surrender, I thought like, oh, surrender's like going and taking a nap, like
Yeah,
just being like, okay, I'm done for the day. But that's
yeah,
not really what it is, right? There's like aspects of like, okay, I've done enough, right? But it's more than that. It's actually the releasing the outcome, really just letting go of what you really want it to be, or you think it should be, or you hope it to be, but rather like, this is my intention, and I have to release whatever the outcome is and just be here for what it ultimately shows up as.
and I love that you reminded us that there's still the intention. Like, just because you're surrendering doesn't mean you give up on your dreams, doesn't
Right.
mean you lie back and become that victim of circumstances. You can still have dreams and goals and intentions and aspirations, but it's surrendering to the whatever the outcome will be.
Yes. Yes.
Mm,
And not feeling like you have to just do until you find the
mm,
answer.
mm.
That's been the greatest gift for me, has been like, you know what? Sometimes the answer comes just sitting next to a stream and listening to the water. Sometimes the answer comes when you are meditating. Sometimes the answer comes when you're petting your cat or your dog, right? Like, we often tell ourselves it needs to be in this like structured way, kind of like, I was like, what are the steps to surrender? And it doesn't. It actually happens the most when we let go. It's almost like we surrender the process. We
Yeah.
surrender to like it happening a certain way, and more of just like, for me, the greatest act of surrender is like getting into alignment with your values instead of somebody
Mm,
else's. And it's
yeah.
just like, yeah, this is me. This is I need to surrender into this so that it can be my North Star in being in a place where I can listen to these messages and have a sense of personal alignment and energy in the process of like letting go of the way I'm going to receive whatever's coming next.
I'll say that in my journey, one of the things that I've struggled most with in terms of surrender is time. And I know many of us, ambitious, driven men and women who have this workaholic background, time is a challenge. Surrendering to the time and letting go of the when it's supposed to happen, not just how, but when, is a
Right.
challenge. How have you addressed that in your life? I mean, here you are, an incredible business owner. You have this phenomenal business now where you're empowering other people. There takes work behind that and intention. How do you release and surrender to the time aspect of things as well?
So that's really big.
Mm.
That's like really big, especially for folks like me who like to have it done when I want to have it done. So I can give you an example. I'm literally moving through this right now. So we have a retreat coming up in Greece, and it was one of these things that was like I wanted it to be sold out by this date, right? Like it
Mhm.
was like I wanted to be sold out 3 months in advance so that I didn't have to worry about any more marketing and all these kinds of things, right? And so I had told myself, right, I'm going to manifest this. This is how it's going to happen. And here we go. We still have 2 spots left. And so it's an experience that there are so many things I could do right now that are like, I could do more emails. I could do more things on social media. I could do ads. I could make more phone calls. I could do all these things. But everything inside of me is like surrendering to, just because it didn't happen on my false deadline that we do all the time to ourselves,
I
right? We're like,
do.
if I don't do it by this time, then I'm a failure. Um, and so what's been so beautiful has been ever since I like stated out loud, I'm surrendering now, and I'm not putting my foot on the gas anymore. I've put all the gas is now gone. I'm surrendering to whatever happens. And literally overnight, as long as these people follow through, we're sold out. So it's one of these things of like, I didn't know any of these people were going to come my way. This is random sort of connections on LinkedIn and folks that I didn't even know were signed up on our newsletter and things like that, that I just was so wanted to control when that happened. And the minute that I just stated out loud, I'm letting go, because this time thing in my head is actually not real. The real thing is, as soon as we arrive, that's when we need to have all the people there.
Wow. Mary Beth, that's so big. That's such an enormous superpower. You
Thank
you
you.
mentioned that you had some practices that you could share with us on how to cultivate this strength. What are
Yeah.
your suggestions for practices to cultivate the ability to surrender?
One of my favorite practices, and this is more of a reactive practice of when I'm not surrendering, right? So it would be like, okay, how so I can give you a proactive and a reactive. This is my favorite reactive. When I'm like the example I just gave of like, if I didn't have that happen by a certain time, usually I'd then start to go into racing thoughts of not
Mhm.
enoughness, right? Of
Mhm.
like, well, of course this isn't going to work out. This never was going to work out. Who do you think you are? Those kinds of things. And so what I do in those moments, like as soon as I catch myself going into that spiral, I do what in mindfulness is Tara Brach calls the sacred pause. So
Mhm.
sacred pause is, are you familiar with this concept? Yes,
Yes,
of
but
course you
please
are.
illuminate, especially for our audience members who may
Yes.
not be. So please
Yes.
expand a little bit on her sacred
Yeah.
knowledge.
A sacred pause is really just an opportunity to, as soon as you notice that you're in one of those places, you literally just pause, you take a breath, and then you shift into observing it versus being in it. So I can watch myself go on a spiral of not enoughness versus being in a spiral of not enoughness. And I can't get to that place of watching it until I've taken the time to pause and say, what am I witnessing that's happening right now? What am I witnessing? Okay. I'm that. Okay. That. And so what I do is in real time, I get out a piece of paper and I make 2 columns. I get a red pen and a green pen. This is just like, I'm a color person. I have my markers always next to me.
I love it.
Yeah. And so I write down all of the things that are coming up for me in that, the stories, right? The stories of, well, I never should have thought that. I never should have thought that. And then, so I write those in red, and then I respond to them from a place of surrender in green. So if I said something like, well, you're never would be good enough for people to follow you to Greece, right? A response I might say to myself is, of course you are. Look how many I've already signed up, right? And so it's like I'm responding from a place of compassion as if my best friend were hearing my inner thoughts. And my best friend could soothe me because she knew exactly what I needed to hear, right? And that's what we are. We are our own best friends when we do this kind of work. And so what I do is I then take, after I've gone through the process of like getting it all out, I then really sit with everything in green, that positive, and that's what I surrender to. I use that as the news story of like, now I'm going to take this as the truth, own this as the truth, and really bathe in it. And I do that through breathing. I do that through meditating. I do that through taking a walk, being with nature, but really having that as the replacement of what I'm going to really melt into.
Beautiful. I love that. I love using that practice as in a framework of surrender. So cool. So cool.
Yeah.
Oh, I love it. Have there been any shifts for you in doing this work in terms of um, greater success or greater impact that you've been able to have? In other words, like, okay, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Kind of reflecting to your former self when you were efforting and doing and forcing and pushing, as opposed to the evidence of what happens when you do allow for the surrender.
Yeah. I mean, it's huge. So back before doing this kind of work, I mean, as most business owners, there's a certain level of like, where is the next client coming from?
Yeah.
Right. And like being strategic about that. That's nothing, that's a good thing. That's a positive thing. Right. But there also oftentimes comes a level of fear associated with that, right? Of like, is there enough? I don't know. Maybe there's not enough, right? And so ever since I really started to go into these surrender practices, my business has quadrupled. I have never had this many inbound requests for this work. I have never charged the amount of money that I currently charge. And it's like one of these things, it's like every time we just charge a little bit more and like nobody's even balking at it.
Wow.
And I think it's a combination of things. I think it's one, doing good work, right? Like
Yeah.
doing good work and attracting more folks who are attracted to this kind of work, and people's lives being transformed as a result of the work. And so there's so many living testimonials. But then the other side of it is people today, and I'm sure you experience this in your work too, they are so craving learning from people who actually live this way versus have gotten some kind of a, certification in a model of something. Those things are great. I'm not poo-pooing that in any way, but rather it's like, oh, you know how to set a boundary? Tell me about that, right? Like, how do you do that? You know how to identify your values? How do you actually live your values, right? Those kinds of questions that are deeper than, I have this degree or whatever, but rather I've gone through the trenches, and I'm still going through them, and I'm going to go through them with you. And I maybe maybe I've gone through that a couple years ago, and I can help you find a path as a result of that experience, combined with, the wisdom of all the teachers that I learned from. But that has been huge too. It's like, people, look at you, like, asking me to read this poem, right? It's just such a beautiful example of, I found that today, in the world we live in, more and more people are attracted to the individuals who are living it, who are really living it.
Mm. Thank you for living it. I'm serious about that because I know along the road and along the journey, there are these fears and questions of, am I worthy of this? And can I do this? And, especially when the more we do the work, the more we illuminate more work to be done. There's always, it's never ending.
I know,
You
it's
think
for forever.
it's forever, and you think you've surrendered, and then there's more to surrender too.
Yes,
And, so
yes.
I honor you, and I'm so grateful that you are here sharing this incredible work and then living it, having the courage to live it and keep living it, and not let that stop you from continuing to support others in that journey. So thank you so much.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you too. And I will say, one of the reasons why I was super excited to talk to you is that we both have roots in the orthodontia and dentistry space.
I
And so I
know.
thank you also for listening, right? And for tuning in and to following this, because I started there too. And it's quite a big jump,
Yeah,
into something different. That
yeah.
that that was really something that I thought I was supposed to do. And so it's really cool to be with a kindred spirit in that
I
way.
know, it's so weird how many intricacies there are between our stories. I would love for you to leave us today. I could talk to you all day, Mary Beth, but I wanna honor your time, and I also would just love for you to leave us today with an idea of what is your definition of happiness?
Mm. My definition of happiness is when my insides and my outsides match.
Mm, I love that. I love
Yeah.
that.
I'm
Tell
like,
me
I don't
more.
know where that came from, but maybe I've heard that somewhere. But really, it's like, where it's just full authenticity, right? Just like,
Mm,
whatever it is, not saying that it has to always be. It's interesting because I actually find myself to really appreciate the sadness in a
mm,
way that I didn't before,
mm,
because of all the wisdom that the sadness holds. It really, there's a lot there, in the same way that the happiness holds a lot of wisdom.
mhm,
But I
mhm.
found that when I take the time to really be in the sadness and to gather the gems that it has to offer, the happiness comes even bigger on the opposite side of it.
Yeah. Oh, beautiful. Thank you, my friend. Thank you so
Thank
much for being
you.
here. Thank you for sharing these gems with us today. And hopefully, we'll chat again soon because I just feel like there's so many other things we could talk about.
Oh, I
And
would
I
love
just am
that.
so grateful to you and have a fabulous time at your event in Greece.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. And thank you to all of you for joining us here today. Thank you for always being open to a new perspective and for acknowledging and sharing in your truth. Until next time, bye bye.